Hello. Welcome to an introduction to the Battle of Malaya and 4C. Now, I'm going to be talking through the various things of this, but you're going to see me emphasizing with the slide information quite a lot of what was happening on in the land campaign, and that's because the land campaign matters. The land campaign has a very big bearing on what is going to take place. The reason why the land campaign is going to have a big bearing on what's going to take place is because the sea campaign, in many ways, is a response to the realities of the land campaign. And therefore, it's kind of like, how best to describe it? Every time I read through Malaya, I get a strong instinct of Crete, of Norway, of those various operations. And that is definitely a factor in what will be Admiral Phillips' thinking. So, we're going to go through this. First, we're going to start looking at the actual history to an extent, as quick as you can do it in the nicest way with the facilities I have available and within a sort of a reasonable amount of time. And then I'm going to go through what my plan would be for this hypothetical. And I'm looking forward to this discussion because I have a feeling this is going to tax my knowledge of it, but also it's going to be kind of interesting seeing what you will come up with. And rather like with the idea of the 4K, I've laid out the criteria I've used for how I would plan and how I would operate and what would I be thinking of. I'd love to see what some of you come up with as your ideas for how you would deal with it. The interesting thing is, though, if you change the British battle plan significantly, how does that change the Japanese battle plan significantly? Which is, as you will see, I've done some things to try and factor in and hopefully minimize the likelihood of that when I'm sort of in my own plan. So I can minimize likely Japanese changes. But we'll see. Anyway, this is to be recorded. This is being recorded Monday, and it's going to be coming out Tuesday. The big video is Tuesday. This video might come out tonight, actually. It might. Not, but it might. Right. Let's see if we can get this to. Every time I forget to click on it before it starts. First off, bilge pumps. Whee! There is a link down in the bio. There is the links I'm going to go through and change soon, hopefully, because we're going to have our whole new streamline, and there's going to be 2 out this week, and there's going to be 2 out next week. And if you're all very nice to me and Jamie, actually not to me mainly because I'm quite keen on the idea, but to Jamie and Drac, we might well have 2 out the following week before we settle down into our normal 1 a week. Because we've got that many built up in the reserve because we've been sorting things out. It's going to be advertisement, all sorts of things, but bilge pumps is coming. We still are running a competition for the new logo and all this sort of stuff to replace the bluish one. And yeah, it's good. And that's one of the memes come from Discord. Although the both memes used today are actually Jamie's own memes. This is the interesting thing. On my Discord channel, a server, Jamie has now been putting up memes about bilge pumps on there because, well, really, he just feels that's easier than hosting his own section on it. So he's making use of mine, and I love it. I do love the fact that mine's also got the bilge pumps chatting on going on it. It's quite cool. It gives me a lot more stuff. It gives me even more stuff to go and chat with on Discord when I'm trying to avoid doing the work I'm supposed to be doing. Right. Why Malaysia and Singapore matter. It should be obvious. Now, the whole joy of Malaysia and Singapore and defending it is that it is the bit in the middle around which everything else spreads. It's the principal gateway into the Indian Ocean. because otherwise you have to go a long way round out of your way. And it is the major port in that region. It is a critical port if you're trying to defend India and Australia as part of your imperial possessions or Commonwealth allies or whatever you want to call it. In the nicest way, you need to control Singapore because it's the linchpin in the middle. And if you've got Singapore, you can have your fighting going on there, and you can hopefully keep people past that island chain, um, Java, etc. And therefore, you can have your merchant ships coming down the nice Indian Ocean shelf there, which you can nicely see running along, and get to Australia without getting into too much trouble. Now, it doesn't make it easy to defend, but it also doesn't make it that difficult to defend if you specifically look at it from that criteria. There are areas around there which you can have minefields you can put on submarines. And there is available things going on. And the trouble is, it's all spread out quite a bit. So, the outline of what happens in the Malaysia campaign. This is the broad strokes. 70,000 strong 5th Army of the Imperial Japanese Army invades Malaysia on the 8th of December, and by the 15th of February 1942, they have routed and destroyed, conquering Singapore, a force of 86,000 troops. Now, it's never that easy. The Commonwealth troops were, at least 15,000 of them were rear area troops, not really for combat troops. Large numbers of them were untrained. Virtually no units were up to full strength. I think there's one British division which is up to full strength. So there are lots of reasons you can put in for why that isn't a fair assessment. And I have tried to be fair, and I have always used a proviso. I am a naval historian doing this. I have tried to be fair. But if you look at the one closest to me, the picture closest to me, well, the half of the picture closest to me, you see how the British forces were arraigned. And British and Commonwealth forces were arraigned. And furthest away from you see what the Japanese army manage. You can see there are areas which it's very, very difficult to move through. And you can see there is, which is less difficult to move through. You can also see where the British and Commonwealth forces do try and establish a defensive perimeter in Johor before Singapore, a long way before Singapore. That would actually have been a fairly good defensive perimeter, and you could have done it. But by that point, you have all those little battles which have taken place, which have bled. More importantly, they've not only bled the troops of their numbers, but they've bled them of the morale and a lot of their officers and NCOs. And this is far more critical. When you have untrained troops and largely untrained troops, and your trained strength, which is your officers and your NCOs often in this case, are even more critical. In those scenarios, you often find surprisingly senior officers leading platoons and all these things because, your junior officers, your junior NCOs can't really do it. Or you have a senior NCO there because they don't have the experience, and you haven't got the experience within the unit to make up for it. Usually when you have a junior officer, if you consider in the peacetime army, you have some very experienced NCOs with them. So the odds on them managing to muck things up bad enough is very limited because the senior NCOs will hopefully guide them while they're still learning how they're going to do it. And there might even be a more senior officer, a more experienced officer there as well. These things are useful to train people in making decisions. This was not a nice battle. This was maneuver warfare jungle style being done. There were tanks on both sides, although not that many good ones on either side. And frankly, The trouble for, and we'll get into this, the trouble really was that to defend Malaysia had first been, and Singapore, had first been basis of the fleet, which was going to go out to Singapore, and then from there it would be able to attack Japan. And the idea was first it was sort of how to fight Japan, and then defending Singapore becomes critical to fighting Japan. Therefore, defending Singapore becomes almost as important as fighting Japan, and defending Singapore is an issue. There are lots of issues with defending Singapore. We'll get into some of these. But the biggest issue is that once they realized they couldn't get a fleet out there fast enough, they realized they weren't going to pay the money for there to be a large army, so they built a load of airfields, which they had to defend. And you have something like you have 3 to 4 dozen, depending on. It's going to sound strange. Officially, they are battalions. Okay, so I would say yes, it's officially almost 4 dozen battalions, but reality, they are none of them are up to full strength. So let's say it's about 3 dozen equivalent battalions maximum of strength of troops basically defending airfields and things around Malaysia. And you sit there and go, why? You're basically penny packaging your troops all over Malaysia, which is a big place. Okay? And the thing is, if you're already short of experience and all these things, we'll get into it as we go on. Let's go into the next one. So, this is the forces available. You've got the Third Corps. You've got forces divided between Krokal and Fortress Penang, which is really not a fortress. You've got the 11th Coastal Regiment, Hong Kong and Singapore Royal Artillery, which is wandering. They're officially listed as being in one place, but I find them turning up all over the place. You have the Australian 8th Division, which is 2 brigades strong. You have Fortress Singapore Division, which is also 2 brigades and all sorts of things. And the Malaysian Command Reserve, which is also down in Singapore, which is the 12th, actually, Infantry Brigade. Sorry, I keep getting confused now. I keep calling it the 17th for some reason. It's the 12th. I'm not going to start recording this again for a 4th time because I've said 17th rather than 12th. I just apologise. And this is what arrives in January, February is the 18th Infantry Division, which is the most complete formation they receive, and the 44th Indian Infantry Brigade and the 45th Indian Infantry Brigade. Right, here's the first trick for if you want to look at a very worrying scenario. When you have divisions formed of sequential units, that usually means those brigade units were all raised and formed at roughly the same time, which usually means they're brand new, and therefore means you have a problem because they're not that experienced. So let's consider this. We have the 6th Indian Infantry Brigade, the 15th Indian Infantry Brigade, and 28th Gurkha Infantry Brigade, which is probably one of the Indian Army numbers. You have also the 22nd Indian Infantry Brigade and the 8th Indian Infantry Brigade. There's a lot of very close together numbers here. The 12th Indian Infantry Brigade. A lot of very close together numbers. So, you have a lot of inexperienced troops. And they're going to do the best. Again, the Australian Division, 8th Division, 22nd Brigade, and the 27th Brigade. Don't get me started on the 1st and 2nd Malayan Brigades. But you have artillery, you have various formations. You do have a fighting force here. It needs time to train it up. It does, but what I'm trying to say is they've got an uphill struggle. And I am going to, because the formation of the question is how would I defend Malaysia and how would I command Force Z, I am very much concentrating these videos on the British side of the spectrum, on the British formations and the Commonwealth formations. The 25th Army is formed up of 3 divisions, each of 3 regiments, various strengths. One division is far stronger than the others, but it's a viable formation, and they have been working together for quite a while in comparison to these ones. Right, air bases. All these aircraft are spread out between 4 air bases in Singapore and 5 around Malaya. And they are in penny packets everywhere. You've got 47 Bristol Blenheims, you've got 36 Vickers Wildebeests, 3 Consolidated Catalinas, 60 Brewster Buffaloes, 24 Lockheed Hudsons. You have 30 Hurricanes, roughly, which managed to turn up sort of in time to get involved. Now, if you were the commander of air forces on, I don't know, Malta, that would be your wet dream. I mean, that would literally be the absolute dream. If you had that many aircraft and you were commanding Malta, you would be ecstatic. Combined with radar, air defense of Singapore is possibly a viability, especially when the Hurricanes turn up. Because if the Hurricanes manage to turn up before the Japanese reach Singapore, you then have quite a lot of fighters there. Quite a lot of good ones. And remember, in peacetime, you talk about destroying enemy air attacks. In wartime, you settle for breaking up enemy air attacks to make your anti-air artillery, which you've got quite a lot of in that army if you looked back earlier, more viable. There is a lot of anti-aircraft artillery in that army. But they're spread all over the place. And one of the interesting things you'll see with the Japanese attacks, and I'll discuss, is the Japanese attack in 3 places so that they are, when they're launching an assault, so they are going to be spreading out the fighters, which they already know the British have spread everywhere around the gunner out. So there will be far more less likely for there to be fighter coverage. It should foresee the 2 battleships come and intercept. Forces available, December. There is a 3rd battleship. Well, there is a battleship. There are 2 more battleships, actually. There's Royal Sovereign and Revenge wandering around in the Indian Ocean. So you actually, technically, here's the thing. You have more ships than 4C. But they're older ships. They haven't been modernized. Repulse hasn't really been modernized either, but they're even less modernized than Repulses. And they're sitting in the ocean. Indomitable arrives in January. Ramillies arrives late January, early February. You have all sorts of ships arrive, but this is the entire forces you have available under Admiral Phillips. And when he goes north, he of course goes north in 4C with a battleship of Prince of Wales, a battle cruiser, Repulse, and I think it's 4 destroyers, including HMS Vampire, Tenedos, and a couple of E-class. There are 11 destroyers in out there, and he ends up taking. I'm giving a clue away here because when I produced the force, first I was just going to go into the one about what would be my plan because I felt that plan was knowledge rough, and then I decided I had to do one which I was going into the existing plan, and I had to use the same forces across and explain them. So I've kind of left one of the clues of one of my ideas for how to fix the problem in Malaysia. Lieutenant General Percival was appointed in April 1941, had a broadly successful interwar career, didn't really have the best relationship with his Brigadier of Engineers. That's Ivan Simpson. What more can I say about him? He's a nice guy. I think half the trouble that happens in Malaya and all these things in 1941 is 1942 is down to the fact that he's a nice guy and won't do what's necessary because that's not his way. He doesn't seem to. He's a nice guy, but he doesn't seem to be able to build a consensus, and he's got constantly bickering commanders, or B, whack them down hard. Okay, you have two methodologies you can deal with when you've got commanding officers from completely different groups constantly arguing with different mindsets of how they want to deal with problems. You have two options. You get them around a table, you build a band of brothers a la Nelson style, or you kick one of the most ones. Or you kick one of them hard, basically. Your options are always how do you keep control of your formations? You can either, fire one of the brigadiers who's more annoying to you than the others, or you build a consensus. Those are your two options. Now, if you're Percival, he is not able to build a consensus, it seems. Mainly because he seems to be, in a way, daunted by the task he has in front of him. And he understands the task. That's one of Harvey's trouble is he understands the scale of the task. I've got to defend Malaya with only this troops. I don't... How can you do this? But he doesn't... How do I put this? Where is it? There it is. The problem for Percival is he really suffers post-war because he's a very, very nice guy. In his comparisons with the other leader in the Major General Britain has in the Far East, well, when I say Major General, I mean Senior General, is Field Marshal Slim. Now, contrast, if Slim, at this point, who is wandering around Delhi and then off back to Iraq and all sorts of things, had been put in charge, rather than Percival, if you consider his standard format, he would have had everyone look into it. He would have taken all their opinions. Then he'd have made some decisions, and if they hadn't started implementing them immediately, he'd have kicked their butts hard, if not fired them. He wouldn't have had any qualms, and he'd just done it. Now, this doesn't mean Slim is a nasty guy. It doesn't mean Percival is a super nice guy. Percival is just, that's not his style, and unfortunately, what is a good style for being a very senior general, a brilliant career general in terms of peacetime, interwar period, and the things he's been doing, and being a general who can deal with the scenario when you're at the end of a logistics line, when you've got limited resources and you've got almost seemingly insurmountable odds, is a different matter. Because honestly, he needed to make some hard decisions, and he doesn't. But it's not all his fault, okay? I'm not gonna say it's all Percival's fault. And it's definitely not all Phillips' fault. Phillips is a career destroyer officer who gets rapidly promoted. He's one of the youngest admirals the Royal Navy has in World War II. He dies at the age of 53, so that tells you how young he was to be a full admiral. Um, he arrives in Singapore on the 2nd of December 1941. Japan invades on the 8th of December 1941. He turns up with two capital ships as a battleship and a battle cruiser, Prince of Wales and Repulse. He doesn't have any more resources with him than that. He's technically in charge of the fleet, but he's now in Singapore, and the Japanese are invading Malaya. He is faced with a similar situation which Cunningham will face in Crete, which the Royal Navy faced at Dunkirk, at Namsos in Norway, and all other places. You have the army bleeding, you have the air force bleeding. The navy can't stand away. The navy can't keep away. So, like any destroyer officer, when you're faced with a superior enemy, how do you deal with them? You get in close and you hit them hard. And that's what he does. Two problems. He has no air cover, and it's very difficult to get air cover. And the aircraft are all busy. He's doing radio silence because that's how he thinks he can avoid the enemy finding him. He thinks the enemy will only find him if he's making radio communications. I'm not sure which particular exercise he's been listening to in the interwar period. There had been a few where that had happened, but he's not making a necessarily. He's in a terrible position, and he's trying to make the best decision he can be. And frankly, the fault for this one does lie with Churchill, because against everyone's advice, he bases battleships in Singapore. And I will get into this in my alternative history, the thing is, once they're based in Singapore, they have to respond if there's an invasion in Malaysia, and the lovely people that is the Japanese are very, very good at warfighting. And they had worked out that Force Z would have to respond, and so they adapted their plans for that. So they were invading at 3 points, so they're spreading out the fighters anyway. Then you have radio silence, but also he does take a very, very small force with him to go into the fight. He's got a pair of capital ships and a handful of destroyers. Honestly, there's part of me which wonders, and I'll discuss this later, whether he might have been better if he'd managed to mass all his destroyers, left his battleships behind, and gone north in them. That's a possibility. I'll discuss it. I'll figure it all out as I go. Right. So this all leads up to they fight through Malaysia. Every time they try and do a stand, for some reason, when you're making a stand, when the best one is put up by the Australian division. Honestly, the Australian division does a great job. They hold a stand, but there's so many Japanese. They manage to work around their edges, and you just, for some reason, I can't think why, a 2-brigade infantry, Australian infantry division, cannot hold up 3 divisions of Japanese army soldiers alone. I can't think why. They are, yeah. Anyway, so this is Percival's plan for defense of Singapore. And he thinks the Japanese are going to come in the northeast because that's where he sees their moving forces. And so he thinks, the enemy's moving that way, so that must be the way the enemy's coming. And then the enemy, of course, come from the northwest. And the real rub of the matter is that the forces, these are units which have already been beaten up, have been defeated, have all sorts of things going along. And they're already missing command structures and people in the positions and all these things. And they start falling apart, falling inwards, and he loses control of the reservoir. Doesn't have anyone protecting it. I don't like to heap all the blame on people. Okay? You shouldn't do it, because history is complicated and very rarely is anyone entirely to blame. But the problem for Percival is he's the man in charge. It's his job. He's the boss. And the whole campaign is just a mess. And he's been the boss since April. In the nicest way, Phillips, he was put in charge. He only arrives on the 2nd of December. He's literally got 6 days. He doesn't even have a full week. So, and he's deployed the forces he is deployed, and Indomitable gets bashed on the way. Although, in the nicest way, if he had Indomitable and the battleship and the battlecruiser and still those pitiful handful of destroyers in his formation, it probably still wouldn't have managed to achieve anything, because whilst they might have had air defense and they might have been able to break up the Japanese attacks, that would still be a very, very small force. You know, especially when you consider how large a naval formation is out there, what could have been viably put forward. But then it comes down to the defense of Singapore again. Okay, so the naval guns, the big ones, can turn landwards. They can fire inland. They just don't have many high explosive shells. And in the nicest way, they don't have many shells. No one's done much to clear their fields, the fields of fire for the people holding the positions as they were drawing it. They haven't done any defensive positions. Apparently, it's because Percival told Simpson not to. There's no point. It would sap the morale of the men. But I think most likely it's because he was faced with this task of training and all these different things to defend. And where do you build the defensive fortifications under those circumstances? I can understand his logic on that aspect, but he's missed something. But that's I can say with hindsight. And Singapore falls. What's the real rub is that the Japanese were actually running out of ammunition, food, everything. If the British had held on for another couple of days, the Japanese probably would have been surrendering to them. That's how bad it was for the Japanese supply. So it's a bluff on the Japanese side. They have pushed down and they have managed to bluff it because it's just Singapore is one of those scenarios where, frankly, everything that can go wrong does go wrong, but you can see it go. It's going to go that way before it even begins because of the way they're deployed. So, right, what do we got coming up in July? Well, there's not sure how, but back pocket cruisers has become back pockets done properly. No idea where the cruiser went. But that's on Thursday. Woohoo! It's back pocket cruisers. Yay! And the book should be in with the publishers completely with pictures and everything by the time I actually go to bed this evening. Well, probably tomorrow morning, let's be honest. It's usually about 2 a.m. by the time I finished. Monday the 6th of July, Patreon video. Well, hey, the first one, and it's in Happy's. What stuff would you put in warehouses at the end of World War I for World War II if you were in command, and why? So many options. So many. Thursday night of July, flying boats or seaplanes. Actually, that's the interesting thing. The Catalinas in this one, they get so underused. It's 14th of July, some more admirals, engineers, and historians. I'm going Russian on you. I'm going American. I'm going a little bit French. And possibly a little bit Italian. I was considering doing the whole Chinese Zheng He, but my book on him I can't really find at the moment. And then it's naval diplomacy. How you get people to do what you want them to do by being very nice, being very friendly, and walking very softly, but making sure they can see a very big stick if you need it. Ooh, making Mare Nostrum a hollow jest. Woohoo! And Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. That would, of course, been very, very different if Singapore had been retained control of. Interesting question is whether Somerville would have been deployed to take over the post of Phillips or not. Of course, if he hadn't been deployed, but someone who is as natural, seems as aggressive as Phillips, with actually having a decent force and still being alive, who knows what happens? Or maybe we go to full American system. We have 2 task force commanders who swap in and out so that so we can rest commanders. All interesting options. And then the pre-tribals are in destroyer force before the beauty that is the tribal class came into service. All hail the tribals. Now, where else can you find me? Twitter at AC_Naval History, and a few other places as well. I'm now sort of looking at. I'm even on Instagram. Disturbingly enough, we can all worry about me being on Insta. That was thanks to some very, very nice students I taught in a school at Cambridge a couple of years back. Patron? Well, it's my book money. Thank you. It's very, very critical for my book money. It's lovely. It's basic. Thanks to that, and thanks to the very kind patrons and subscribers and people who've liked and shared these videos, that I have money to keep buying books, even though my hours of teaching, for some reason I can't think why, under current circumstances, has dropped. Joys of being contract lecturer. And Global Maritime History. Now that is a good site. A lot of interesting stuff there. So, that was the Battle of Malaya and 4C, and what happened. Basically, it can be summed up as this. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and it went wrong hard. And that's the problem in the end. It goes wrong hard. And it doesn't help that the personalities you have in command are not really suited to the scenarios they find themselves. They're both good officers, but they're not suited to the scenarios they find themselves in. I think that's the fairest I can be. Anyway, take care, chat soon, and another one's coming in a second.